So 15 years ago, when I taught at the University of Rochester, I needed an assistant, and I was very fortunate to meet this individual, Stephen Yano. And he moved from Texas, where he lived, to Rochester, New York, to be my assistant with the debate program there. We were very successful. And as a result of that success, he started becoming interested in potentially pursuing a career in academia. And he went to graduate school, first of all at Syracuse University in their famous Rhetoric program, and he got a master's there. Then he went to University of Pittsburgh and got his Ph.D. in Rhetoric. And now he is a professor and teaches at St. John's University in New York City. And this is the part where I took advantage of our friendship. I convinced him to get on a bus and ride, in a very uncomfortable bus, and ride for over 4 hours to come here, to arrive today about an hour and a half ago. I did take him out to dinner at Statler. But it wasn't really worth 4.5 hours in an uncomfortable bus. And he's one of the best lecturers I know on the issue of introduction to rhetoric. He's a rhetorician. He has a PhD in rhetoric. Most of you, I believe, don't really even understand what rhetoric is. I didn't really discuss it very much the very first class. I mainly went over the syllabus and told you sort of the pedagogy and how the class would be taught. Now Professor Yano is going to lecture for the next couple hours, and he's going to teach you more than you need to know in a very enjoyable way. He has a whole slide presentation he's going to do about what rhetoric means. Look around, there's a few empty seats. I think there's some people that didn't clean the class today. Professor Yano's lecture will be on the test. It's probably a good idea to take a few notes, right, of what he talks about. And are you going to film this, Professor Yano?
Oh yeah, I am.
And so what if they want to get access to the film in order to memorize it for
Well,
test
if
purposes?
it turns out okay, I'll put it on YouTube. But if not, it'll go in the vault.
But okay, let's
I can give you a copy, Sam, and then you can...
Yeah, and then I can distribute it somehow.
Yeah, you can distribute it far and wide.
Yeah. But that would be great. I hope it ends up on YouTube.
Yeah, I can put it up there. I mean,
Yeah.
if it'll be helpful for you guys, I'll put it up there even if I...
Yeah. So
I think
let's
so.
hear it for Professor Yano.
Okay, I wonder, are there markers for this thing? Or?
Yes.
Sam, do you know?
I don't have any.
Under the eraser.
Look at that, did I? So yeah, I have a lot of things I can talk to you about, but I think the easiest way to think about what we're going to do tonight is to think about your own field of study or what you major in, and rhetoric is not that much different than that, because there's 3 terms that it circulates around. What do you guys, first of all, I guess a good way to start is to think about what you think rhetoric is. Have you heard this term used before? Do you have an understanding of it yourself? Like if someone calls something rhetoric, what do they mean? Does anybody want to share?
I often hear it mispronounced rhetoric.
Rhetoric.
Oh, I see you are practicing rhetoric on me. But that's mispronunciation.
Does anybody have a sense of, or like, what do you think it means? It might not be that far off.
You must have some idea. You signed up for a damn class on this.
Well, many of you have never heard it before you sign up for the class.
Like public speaking of some sort?
Public speaking, that's very good. That's a pretty right in the middle sort of understanding of what rhetoric is. Very good. Yeah.
Honing actual content that's coming out of your mouth and knowing why you're saying it. And
Okay, so like the content of a speech, more honing on the actual content of the speech.
yeah.
Okay. That's an unusual one. Usually people say the opposite.
The book says something about like using symbols when you talk,
Mm-hmm.
or when you speak.
Yeah, using symbols. So one definition of rhetoric that's a very common definition is Foss and Trapp. And they said, I think this might be the definition of the book,
Yeah, that's
that rhetoric is the uniquely human ability to use symbols to communicate. But this definition has threats to it. Because as you've probably seen on television, we show a symbol to a dolphin and it runs and gets a ball and brings it back. It depends on if you think that's communication. Or you know about gorillas that use sign language. So this definition is under threat of what rhetoric might be. It might not be the uniquely human ability, but it might be something about symbolic communication. Anybody else want to chime in?
I mean, what do the rest of you guys think? What if I came in here, welcome to rhetoric class, I start poking you with a stick? And you're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, rhetoric?
You haven't done that yet, Sam? Watch out. It's coming. Yeah.
Like, I always thought rhetoric was how you speak, whether you're more forceful or what kind of words you use.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah. So all these things you guys are saying are pretty good. Symbols, very important. Style, content, and public speaking. Rhetoric comes from an ancient Greek word, rhetoros, which means an orator, a public speaker. And that's where the term originates. But the study of rhetoric, and any of your major, whatever your major is, I don't know, are all of you guys industrial labor majors? Or
No, there's a whole
variety of different majors?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all of your majors circulate, the things they teach you circulate between three terms. So all three of these things are present, sort of in relationship with each other. And they all circulate, they all interact with each other in your field too. You can sort of think about how these things work in your field as well. You're learning theory, you're learning practice, and you're learning criticism of theory and criticism of practice, which in practice can generate criticism, practice can generate theory, theory shows us how to practice, theory generates criticism, sometimes criticism generates theory, sometimes practice will generate theory. So all these relationships go in all the different directions. Rhetoric is the same. There's theories of rhetoric, practice of rhetoric, criticism of rhetoric. And scholars of rhetoric do all three in different degrees. I would say practice is probably the one they do the least often, unless, of course, you call it teaching rhetoric, which some people have defined it as that. But tonight, what I'm going to do is sort of show you, give you kind of an orientation to rhetoric the way it is through definitions of it through history. Different people talking about it. It's a very, very old subject of study. Ancient Greece is where we locate it, but that's not the only place where it's originated. This is where it was called rhetoric, but it originated much, much earlier than that in China and in India and places like that as well. But they didn't call it rhetoric. They called it other things. So most scholars of rhetoric focus on on Western civilization when they're thinking about rhetoric. So all those definitions are good. I'll show you probably one of the oldest definitions. This definition here by this guy. Sam, are you the electrician back there? Can you get the light? Okay. Just so everybody can read it, okay. I'll push this out of the way. This is one of the oldest definitions of it. It comes from a guy named Gorgias. Gorgias
We'll turn on the light so they can see the name.
Yeah. Gorgias was a very, very early proponent of rhetoric in ancient Athens. And he was part of a group of thinkers that were called the Sophists. Has anybody ever read anything about the Sophists or encountered them in another class? Yeah? Who are the Sophists?
They really believed in they would like talk a lot about speech and like weren't there two different forms of them speech like that went through or something? I don't know, I'm forgetting.
Yeah.
You took my argumentation and debate class. Were you asleep during that section?
It must have been a long time ago, yeah.
Yeah.
If you've ever taken a philosophy class and if you've ever read Plato, the Sophists are Plato's enemy. They're the bad guys. They're the people who are Socrates is after. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But Plato argues against the Sophists in almost everything he writes, a sophist is either the name of the book or the target of the attack. And the reason why is because the sophists were, according to him, teaching things that he didn't think were very healthy for society. They were professional speech teachers. Ancient Athens was a very strange place in the time of Plato, in the time of Socrates, around the 4th century, BCE. This is his definition of rhetoric, or speech, which he would have used the term rhetoros, or maybe logos. I'm not really sure what the Greek term would have been then. But the sophists were people who were professional teachers of speech and argument. In ancient Athens, you didn't have a complex legal system. So there were no such thing as a professional lawyer or anything like that. You had to defend yourself if you were accused of something. So if I accuse you of like stealing my chicken, then it goes to trial, goes before a jury of 201 people, and then later in Athens it becomes 501 people. And they hear argument. They hear an argument for each side, and then the people just vote who they think is right. And then the penalty of the law is put forth on the person who's wrong. So if you're accused of something like murder, it's the same thing. Or any big crime, burglary, theft, anything like that. So the sophists made a lot of money saying, I can help you write a speech that will help defend you to the best of your ability. You come and tell me what it is, and I'll write the speech for you. You can memorize it, and you can defend yourself very well. And they made a lot of money doing that. Gorgias did some of that. Other sophists did some of that. The other thing they did was they said they could teach people how to be good people. They make you a good citizen, make you a good professional person. I can make your life valuable. They're sort of like self-help gurus. You know, you go to like the bookstore, you see all these guys in the business section of these books, like, turn your life around. And they got a big smile. This is also something the sophists did, like sort of self-help in a way. And they all had something different that they were good at. Gorgias is the example I use because he was the rock star of them all. He was like beyond any of the other sophists in popularity. If he was going to come to Athens or any Greek city and he was going to read a poem, it would sell out in minutes. Sort of the equivalent of a big hip-hop concert today. The big name hip-hop star. I don't know what you guys listen to, but and my students listen to lots of hip-hop. I don't know who would be the equivalent, but if they came, everybody would just go. And it would be like big, it would sell out in minutes, everybody would want to be at the show. And Gorgias would read like a poem, like The Birds or something, and everybody would be like, this is awesome. Or sometimes he would do his own original compositions. And then at the end he would say, I can show you how to do this. It's not hard. Just come and study with me, pay the money, and I'll teach you. And Socrates would go to these things, Plato would go to these things, and they were horrified because they didn't think thinking was happening. People liked the sound of it. They got caught up in it. And so people would, just like they would at a hip-hop concert today, sort of get into it, right? You go to a concert today, people are moving, right? They were getting into it. Same thing with this poetry and stuff. And they said that this really frightened them. Said this was replacing thought. It was replacing critical approaches. They were getting caught up in the form of it. So earlier when we were talking about definitions of rhetoric, about it's focusing on the content or it's about how you say things, this has been a very old understanding of rhetoric for thousands of years. And Gorgias says this at the end of one of his own original compositions called Encomium to Helen. You guys know who Helen is? Or was? Yeah, Helen of Troy? Yeah. Do you know who she is or who she was?
Not really.
No? Anybody? Yeah?
Well, so the whole war was started over this woman?
Yeah, the war, do you remember the war between who?
The Trojans and the Greeks. No,
Yeah.
wasn't that it?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, not. The Greeks are all like independent little countries, but they all got together to fight the Trojans because they took Helen away, and she's like so amazing, so beautiful. It's kind of a weird story, right? But she's responsible for, gosh, how long were they over there? 20-something years of war. It's like the same kind of thing that we're sort of dealing with, or going to be dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan and that kind of thing. Like long time. Those started over different things. But this very, very long war that embroiled Greece for a long time, killed lots of Greek people because she decided that the king, her husband, the king, wasn't good enough. She wanted to be with Paris, this young guy. He was really hot. And she went with him. But we're not really sure what happened. Maybe he abducted her. The Greek is unclear. The term that they use in the ancient Greek is this term plagiro. which can mean a couple of different things. It sounds like a word you're familiar with in the university, yeah? Plagiero. What English word comes from that? Plagiarism. Very good. Plagiero can either mean to kidnap or to seduce. It can mean both. So when you say that Paris plagiaroed Ellen, it's not very clear what happened. Right? Pretty interesting, huh? So plagiarism comes with that term, which gives you a new insight into what plagiarism means, right? It's kind of a weird sort of thing, right? I'm kidnapping the words or the idea of somebody else, right? Or it's like a seductive move, like I'm pretending like these are my words. Like, have you ever seen like Cyrano de Bergerac, right? Like where he, Christian is really in love with Roxanne, but he's kind of a doofus. And Cyrano's like seriously in love. He's like, just say what I say. And he has all the romantic words, and Christian says them, and she's like, you're so amazing. And she thinks it's him, because Christian's like really good looking. Cyrano has like big nose. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but same sort of thing. So he gave a speech encomium to Helen. Encomium is a speech of high praise, like you would give to like a former president or a big a person who does a lot for the arts or for society. So do you think a lot of people in ancient Athens are fans of Helen? They think she's a good person? No, she's like, no one's naming their daughter Helen in ancient Athens. Not just like you wouldn't name your son Adolf, right? Same thing, right? So it's like it's tainted, right? It's tainted. So when he says, I'm going to give a speech in the highest praise of Helen, people are like, what are you going to say? What could he possibly say? And then he did it, and he praised her, and he's like, look, it's not her fault, or maybe if it is, we should admire those traits in a woman. You can read it. It's online. It's free. It's kind of cool that it survived. It was super popular. And then at the end of it, he said this. So why did I decide to do this? Because I could. Because I could. And then he said, because rhetoric or speech is a powerful lord that with the smallest and most invisible body accomplishes most godlike works. It can banish fear and remove grief and instill pleasure and enhance pity. And that's what he thought the study of rhetoric was the study of these things. So we could put Gorgias, right, this dead center of practice, yeah? But through his practice, we get a theory of what rhetoric is about, right, which is doing these things, right? So Gorgias is kind of an interesting character. He was not Greek, he was Italian, but he really liked living in Greece. He could make a lot of money there. And everybody liked his accent. That's what we know. So he wasn't a native Greek speaker, but he had a really sexy accent, I guess. People loved it. They're like, oh, the way he says things is so great. It's like Antonio Banderas or something. I don't know, something like that. I don't know who it would be for you, but I like the way that guy talks. But maybe you think of somebody else. Anyway, the sophist, it was this particular thing that is what made Plato so incensed, because Plato saw this as the opposite of what we should be doing. We shouldn't be trying to make these things happen. We should be discovering what we should actually be doing, and not just doing these things because we could. And that was a dispute that has gone on for thousands of years in philosophy. And philosophy and rhetoric have not been friends for a long time because of this ancient dispute. So here's the next definition of rhetoric that I'll talk about, which is Aristotle. I don't know if you can recognize him there. We don't know what these people look like. These are some people describe them in ancient texts, but this is a statue of Aristotle. And this is the definition of rhetoric that you'll encounter most frequently, which is the art of identifying all available means of persuasion in a given instance. Comparing this with Gorgias's, what strikes you as the major difference, or one of the major differences between these two understandings of rhetoric?
This is a question for you to answer out loud.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, go ahead.
This focuses on persuasion, which is the key element there, whereas the other one focuses on more emotions, I'd say, fear and greed.
And what does it mean to persuade someone?
To convince them that you are right.
Mm-hmm. Is there a difference between being convinced or persuaded? Like someone's like, I'm persuaded, I'm convinced. Is there a difference?
Yes. You can get someone to do something, but that person may not internalize what you're trying to make them believe.
And being convinced means it's internalized.
Right, like you could say during the Holocaust, like thousands of people killed Jews, but you may be able to argue like those people didn't internalize those beliefs because after the Holocaust they repented and went back and regretted everything that they did.
Mm-hmm. All right. Did you want to say something about it? You had your hand.
No, I was just going to say that this one is, I think, more about argument and manipulating, whereas the other one is just about, like, I would say framing everything.
Mm-hmm. Framing versus arguing versus manipulating. These are all very good terms that circulate in rhetoric all the time. Yeah, in the back.
You said Gorgias focuses on the what, and this one sort of focuses on the how.
Okay. Very good. The what and the how. So where would this put Aristotle on our little chart? Where would he be located? So if we put Gorgias here as a practitioner, so we'll just put a G here. Where do we put Aristotle? Maybe. Yeah, maybe Aristotle is up here. I don't know. You can put him wherever you might think is good. But people dispute and debate about this stuff all the time, about where these people sit. I mean, they have elements of all three. Like, you want to sort of think of the study of rhetoric, and maybe the study of pretty much any field, as sort of, instead of a line, like a lot of times we think of our, we start in a position, and then we get better, we know more, and then we hit some ending point, and then we're good. And this is kind of the way education goes. But education might be more of like mapping the universe, and this is like one of the oldest maps of the universe that exists, which you may have seen before. I'm not going to color the whole thing yet. It's like one of the oldest maps of the universe is the yin-yang, yeah? Which is what it's supposed to be, is a map of the universe, universal energies. So things are moving into each other, moving around, and then there's a little bit of the opposite in each, which is sort of the way that the ancient Chinese philosophers saw life. It was sort of modeled like this. They didn't see things in this sort of linear capacity. Some did. It's not universal, but this isn't universally representative of Western thought either. So this is the way to think about what I'm trying to do here. And also the way your field is sort of getting you familiar with a map of the universe, that not everything is black and white, everything's moving all the time, everything's changing. And in order to understand one element, the other element has to be present in it. Just sort of a way of thinking about what we're doing. So this question of the how and the what is really important, I think, to understand these different rhetorical theories. Very important. Anybody else want to say anything about the two definitions? Anything that strikes you find interesting? Yeah.
I mean, they just seem very similar to me, because Gorgias is talking about using pity and using all these emotions, which can be used as a persuasive tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And persuasion is a very difficult thing. You can study persuasion on and on and on and on. And to persuade somebody, I think this distinction, when we're convinced, we sort of take ownership of the idea. Yeah? It's like inside. When we're persuaded, we go along with it, but we separate ourselves maybe. So be like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Or be like, that's what I've always wanted to do. Right? This kind of like difference in persuasion. You've had conversations today like that, where people are like, would you like to do this? And you're like, yeah, sure, I'll go along. Maybe that's persuasion. You're going to do the thing. But hey, would you like to do this? Oh my God, I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me to do that. Maybe not today, but you've had moments like that, where you're like, yes, that is what I want to be doing right now. Instantly. Anybody else? Anybody else? Chime in. Now these people are separated. Aristotle was alive and around sort of at the time of the sophists, but Plato was quite old. Aristotle was his student. He was quite old at the time he met Plato and learned about why sophistry is bad. But Aristotle then wrote a book on rhetoric, saying it was actually not such a bad thing. It was very useful. Very, very useful for times when we have limited time, we have to make a decision, and we have limited resources, and we have a lot of options. So Aristotle was interested in terms of politics, in terms of how to govern the city. Not necessarily in terms of how to become a good person, which is what some of the sophists would say. Not necessarily in terms of how to be better or self-help or how to create things. There's a lot of sophists who are into creating things. There's sort of like, you can sort of make anything with speech. Aristotle wouldn't necessarily agree with that. He's saying in particular cases, in particular situations, rhetoric is really awesome. And that's like the political, like, hey, the Spartans are fighting the Persians. They are not that far away from us. We need to get ready. We have this amount of money. What should we build? And then people debate it. Figure it out. In the Athens, of course, what's the most important thing about ancient Athens that you've learned in your life, would you say?
I think it's the root of all Western political thought.
Yeah, the root of all Western political thought, which is kind of a weird thing. Like, the Athenians might as well be aliens to us, the way they have their culture and stuff. Very strange. So, a couple of things about Athenian culture. Oh, anybody else want to say something important about? I'm sorry to cut you. I get excited about this stuff. I don't want to kill the discussion. The root of all Western political thought. Athens governed what?
Direct democracy.
A direct democracy, which means what?
That the people voted on every referendum, so it's kind of like if on the ballot now there's Proposition 1, Proposition 2, that's what it was like for everything that happened. So you didn't elect people to represent you, you represent yourself more or less.
That's right. And by the people, who do you mean?
White men that own land.
Yeah, like Athenian Greek men who were property owners, who could prove that they were property owners, could participate in that. So if you moved to Athens, you could have protection, you could have a job, you could have all that great stuff if you were a guy. But if you're born in Lesbos or Thebes or Macedonia or Sparta, nope. No Spartan would ever move there anyway. They're Athenians. They don't even know how to work out.
Does anybody know why the island of Lesbos is very famous today?
Are we going to get into this?
Yeah. It was actually on the front page of the New York Times today.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah. Anybody know? No one here knows what. Anybody know what the New York Times is? It's a newspaper. So Lesbos is where Syrian refugees are fleeing to, and there's a picture on the front page of the New York Times today of refugees that were in a little dinghy that deflated, swimming for their lives to try to get safely to the island of Lesbos.
Yeah, and the shoreline is covered with all these rubber rafts. And
Yeah.
just a wasteland of all this emergency ocean equipment.
Yeah.
Big
But
can of
also,
worms.
Lesbos is where the word lesbian also comes from. Right. Did you know that? No, didn't know that.
Yeah.
Why is it called lesbian?
Gosh, I don't know.
There's a Greek myth.
There's a lot of Greek fact behind it, so I don't know if this is really appropriate for a class, right?
Yeah, this class.
I'll tell you. I don't know the actual Greek word, but in ancient Greece, the women of Lesbos to an Athenian man were considered to be the women that you would want to be with. Because the way it works is that the lesbian people had a cult of the young girl. Now this is very different than the Athenians who had the cult of the young boy. So think about advertising, where you see very young, very scantily clad women in public all the time, right? Billboards, television. The young woman's body is valorized as the peak of beauty, right? That's our culture in America. Now replace that with 14-year-old boy body, and you have Athens. So if we're in ancient Athens, that would be the ad. Instead of Victoria's Secret, where the boy would be wearing very little and sort of posing in that same way that we find comical, right? You see people do this on the internet, right? They'll say, what if superheroes posed like female superheroes? And they put them in the poses, you're like, it's laughable. This is ancient Athens, the cult of the young boy. The young boy's body is beautiful, it's highly sexualized, it's desirable. Everybody wants to touch it. Right? That's ancient Athens. Which a lot of their neighbors, the Spartans, were like, the Spartan slang term for an Athenian is a boy lover. You're like, are you from the boy lover country? Right? The Spartans didn't get it, right? The lesbians had the opposite. In Lesbos, it's the cult of the young girl, which is very unusual. Very unusual. So they have these festivals of the girl, where young girls would take a friend when they were young and explore their desire with their female friend. And this was appropriate to do before you got married to a man. Just to figure out what you like.
And it was encouraged.
They had huge festivals. You know who Sappho is?
Yeah.
Sappho writes poems about this. But like, I find my lover and I take her, and everyone's like, oh, she's such a radical. She's a radical lesbian from the ancient. No, this is very straight, right? This is a pop song. Right? It's like Taylor Swift. Very mainstream, nothing radical about it. Everybody loves it. It can be played anywhere. No one's offended. Now, that's hard to wrap your head around. This is why I say the ancient Greeks are alien, right? So the Athenians used the national name lesbian, right, as a sort of a verb in their language for oral sex, which has made some scholars think that the lesbians invented that in their world, right? Because the Athenians were like, there's this thing that they do over there that's awesome. So to lesbianize someone is to perform oral sex. I don't know if that's appropriate for a class.
Well, let me see.
Is the dean coming in? Oh, hi. Hello. My last time on campus.
Yeah. Security?
Yeah, right, yeah. So the Athenians would use this verb, but not other people. Sort of a slang, like, kind of maybe even like an essentialist, nationalist slur, maybe.
Interesting.
It's hard to know because nobody speaks ancient Greek today. The Greek they speak in Greece today is very different than this 4th century Greek that I'm kind of familiar with.
Ancient Greek.
Ancient Greek. There's 3 kinds of ancient Greek. There's like Homeric, which is what Homer wrote in, and Hesiod and all the ancient stuff. And then there's the Middle Greek, or what they call Attic, or Dorian or Ionic Greek, which is the period of Plato. So it depends on what you want to study. If you want to read Homer, you go take Homeric Greek. If you want to, the most popular Greek is the Koine, which is what is also called New Testament Greek. So you're going into theology, you want to be a minister, or you want to read the Bible, the New Testament, in its original, you would take Koine Greek. If you learn Koine Greek, you can't read Attic or Homeric. If you take Homeric, you can read all 3. If you take Attic, you can only read the Koine, and because I've tried, I looked at the Bible and I was like, oh, I can read that. That's cool. But I can read it in English too, and it's easier. So, easy decision. But the looking at the sophists is very interesting to me, so I want to see the different ways it can be translated. That's why I studied it. But you pick up some of these things, right? But the Athenians didn't have a very high opinion of women as a result. So this gentleman here is talking about direct democracy, but the women don't get to participate. But ancient Athens is a lot like Iran, contemporary Iran, in the sense that if you saw, if a woman's in public, they have to be escorted by their husband or their older brother or their father. They can't go out by themselves. They have to be, their honor has to be preserved at all times. This might be a little off the subject. What time does this class get out? I don't want to burn all the time away.
We'll go till midnight.
Oh, okay, great. Then I have time for all my stories. Yay!
More about Lesbos, please.
Okay, so there's a famous sophist named Lysias who was a great defense attorney, the equivalent of a defense attorney. So if you're interested in ancient defense attorney strategy, Lysias's speeches have been preserved. And one of them was a murder case where he was defending a guy who was accused of murder. The guy came home, found his wife in bed with another man, and killed the guy. Crime of passion, we would call this, yeah? So the guy's family took him to court, so he was a murderer. And his defense was, he was in bed with my wife. This threatens my bloodline. This threatens my son's ability to participate, or to own property, to participate. Like, this threatens their Athenian identity. And in Athens at the time, it was perfectly legal to kill somebody if you found them in the act with your wife, right? It's totally cool, because you're not supposed to do that. Murder them, right? It's fine. They'll probably be killed by the state anyway at the end of the trial. Drink hemlock, right? That's the death penalty. Drink a poisonous herb. That's what happened to Socrates, right? For corrupting the youth. That was he was accused of and convicted. Because he gave a defense speech where he called the jury an ass. Right? He's like, you are all asses, and I'm the fly that bites your ass. This is like a wordplay, right? Between a donkey and a jerk, right? I'm the fly that bites your ass to get you moving, or else you'd stand still and do nothing. So you don't want to call, lawyering 101, you don't want to call the jury an ass if you expect them to support your case. Right? So you can read that in the Apology, Socrates' defense speech. Right? This defense speech was different. He said that, and then he said, but also, the guy who was accused, because it's him speaking in the first person. He's like, but also, I was amazing to my wife. I went above and beyond. She had no reason to cheat on me. You might think I'm like an Athenian man, and my wife is not happy, and she goes to other people for happiness, but here are the things I've done for her. I would have a busy day at work, and I'd come home, and I would give her my mind. That's what it says literally, and I was like translating this. I'm like, I don't know what that means. I would hand her my mind, or I hand her my brain, kind of. And it's an idiom. It means I would pay attention to her, which he's using as valorization, like he's unusual. So if she wanted to talk, I would listen to her. And I would sit there, even if I was occupied with other things, even though I had a hard day at work, I would listen to her prattle on and on. So that's his first thing. The second thing was, if she wanted to go to the Agora, the mall, and we had no groceries to buy, no clothing to buy, nothing to buy for our children, she just wanted to go and speak to her friends at the mall, which is the only way women could really get together and stuff, I would escort her myself. I wouldn't call her dad or make her older brother do it. I would do it myself. And that's like above and beyond. Then the final thing that will really freak you out. So when our son was born, he was very sick. He had a cough. And the doctor said that he shouldn't sleep on the second floor because the night air is bad. Sleep on the first floor where the air is better for the baby. And I kept the ladder up at night so that she could check on him when he cried in the night. And I'm like, what does this mean? So I went to my Greek teacher, and she explained, oh, well, you would make all the women go to the second floor at night, and then you would take any way for them to get out down so they couldn't run out and cheat on you. And the babies would go up there too. And so, fire is a pretty serious thing when they would happen. People would die. They had no way out, right? But he was gracious enough to leave the ladder up so that he wouldn't have to wake up and take care of the baby. That's not his job, right? She could do it. Right? Isn't that? I mean, that just tells you, this is a really great little cultural artifact. It tells you about the status of women at the time. And then there's also that great play, the Lysistrata, where the women get tired of this, and they deceive their husbands, get them drunk or whatever, send them off, and then they get tan, they put on fake beards, they stuff their pants, and then they go to the Democratic Forum and they pass a bunch of laws because no one can tell that they're women. It's a real great comedy. You should read it. It's really good. He knows what I'm talking about. Yeah. So, good stuff. But anyway, that tells you a little bit about this culture where rhetoric comes from, which is weird. Really weird place. It's weird that they're the foundation of Western political thought, isn't it? Or the foundation of direct democracy, because they have a lot of very strange social ideas. The boy, we have the cult of the girl. Both are weird. We don't like theirs because it's not ours. Right? And they also had, all this strange women stuff. But if you saw a woman alone on the street, what could you conclude about her? You're in ancient Athens. You see a woman by herself on the street.
She was a prostitute.
Yeah, she's most definitely a prostitute. Only way you can make a living is a woman who's not Athenian. No job for any woman. Definitely no Athenian woman. They're always guarded by the men in their life. They can't have a moment to themselves. Except when they're sleeping on the dangerous second floor. So most definitely a prostitute. That's the number one, probably the only occupation. What else? Not an Athenian. Probably from some other country. And the third thing you can conclude is she's probably more educated than any of the dudes around her. Because there were lots of women sophists. The most famous one was Aspasia, or Aspasia. And she was the consort of Pericles. You know who Pericles is? Pericles is like the John F. Kennedy of ancient Greece. Like this big time. He was the archon, right? The leader of Athens, the chief executive. For a long time, super historically famous, putting all these plays, all this stuff. And it's thought, since he consorted with this Aspasia, which is in a lot of plays and a lot of writings, fiction writings, kind of like fanfic, I guess, about them being together and all this. And she had these children, but wasn't married, and they might have been Pericles' kids, but they'd have no claim to any property or anything because they're not Athenian. The thought is that all his great speeches were written by her, because she's a sophist. Very well educated, and pretty awesome. You can go read about her. She's one of the coolest sophists out there. If she had been a dude, she probably would have eclipsed Gorgias, I think, in popularity because of her abilities. But she was not, so she kind of had to. She was smart. She kind of stayed in the background. But we know a bit about her. And Plato has her in the Socratic dialogue, Socrates talking about his youth. And they ask him about Aspasia, and he's like, oh yeah, I was at a function as a really young man. Because Pericles was like president when he was really, really young. It would be like, I don't know, for you guys, maybe like Clinton or maybe George W. Bush or somebody like that. Like really young, and then when he was like kind of, they were still kind of in power. She taught him how to dance. Socrates was like, I don't know how to do this dance. And Aspasia's like, it's very important you know how to dance. Incredibly important. It's very important for social occasions, for when there's people around. And she taught Socrates how to dance, according to Plato. It's kind of cool, right? Knowing who she is and knowing what Socrates ended up doing. So, anyway, I'm sort of getting off the track here. But the important thing about this definition of rhetoric is that Aristotle is not saying anything about doing it, but identifying it. And that's what scholars have focused on the most, is the study of rhetoric is figuring out all the available ways to persuade in an instance. And this also brings up the idea that rhetoric is not a universal or absolute thing, but it's a situational thing. It comes up in situations, and it's a situational response. Okay, so moving ahead quite a bit, we have Cicero and Quintilian, who are Romans. We're moving away from Greece and into Rome, and their considerations of what rhetoric is. And Cicero says that rhetoric is speech designed to persuade. So we're getting back to this sort of persuasion, getting people to move, getting people to agree with you, getting people to do something. And Quintilian, this is like a really terrible, I don't know, I thought Quintilian looked cooler than this, but then I found this picture when I was putting this together. I was like, man, he doesn't look very cool. But he was sort of a later Roman. He was at well after Cicero. Cicero was the last person in charge of sort of the Republic, and then Julius Caesar took over. And then he was there at the Senate when Caesar was murdered by Brutus and his friends. And Brutus looked, he said, "We did this for you." And Cicero was like horrified. He's like, "Julius Caesar's like my buddy." Like they grew up together and stuff. It's really interesting to read about. But the different ideas of governance. And then Cicero was eventually killed for speaking out against the state as the empire got stronger and stronger and less into the Senate and any kind of debate or discussion about democratic virtue. Quintilian comes along much, much later. The Emperor Vespasian, at the very end of the Roman Empire, is like, "Our society's corrupt. Kids don't do anything. Everybody wants a handout. Everybody sits around all day. We're losing what it means to be Roman. I'm going to commission someone to write books about how to speak well in public, and that'll bring back virtue. Civic virtue." Right? Sound familiar? It's like, we need more civic virtue and more discussion, or our society is going to fall apart. So he gave a whole bunch of money to Quintilian, and Quintilian wrote 14 books about how to teach young people how to speak well. He was also a speech teacher, like me, like Sam. Except he was paid by a Roman emperor, which has got to be terrifying. Like, what if you write the wrong thing? It's like, not only do you not get paid, you might be killed. So bad news, right? At least we don't have to deal with that. I don't know what your dean is like, but I don't have to deal with that.
He's not like a Roman emperor.
Good. So a good man speaking well is what Quintilian, and this brings rhetoric back towards the sophistic, in a way, right? It's like now it's about your qualities of an individual, which is an interesting thing to think about.
It's very Cicero looks like pretty modern in there.
Yeah, yeah.
It could be like, if I told you guys, "Hey, that's a bust of a CEO of IBM," would you be like, "Yeah, I can see that"?
Yeah, looks like you.
He does. I believe there might be a direct connection.
Yeah, there you go.
He's got a little bit too much hair on top for me.
Yeah, right, around the sides here.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like the way his hair was, or if that's the style of the time.
I think it was the style.
Cicero was like the most educated dude in his family. His parents were really into like making sure he was educated. And they ran a very successful dry cleaner. And that's how they made the money to send him to the best schools and
That's
stuff.
not true.
It's very true.
They did not have dry cleaning.
They did.
And the other thing is, I have a favorite quote from Cicero.
Mm.
In Latin, you pronounce it Cicero because there's.
That's right. Yeah.
But the quote is "Vita est supplicum." You'll get that right.
Oh, that old joke.
Yeah. But it means, and this is kind of summed up as philosophy: life is punishment.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine being around this cheery guy all day. Yeah.
Well, it's like he grew up. Imagine like growing up and some of you probably want to go to law school, I'm guessing, and you like the practice of law, and you think the U.S. justice system is this noble, virtuous thing, and it has flaws, but it's still the best thing out there, and all this. And you're like, oh, democracy and everything. Imagine going through the best school, you go to your dream law school and all that, and then when you go out to practice, the president is like, no more Congress, no more Supreme Court, I'm in charge. I mean, this is kind of Cicero's life, so you can see, how it's going to go. Like, he was practicing law during the collapse of what we call the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire, which is not a democratic institution. Not democratic at all.
So he knows all about justice when he doesn't get to practice it.
Right, yeah. So he became one of the consuls of the state, somebody in charge of the state during this sort of rough period, and was really a defender of it and a real believer in it, but could see the writing on the wall. And it wasn't good for him. He was very old. He was murdered by killed, and then they put his head on a stick and put iron sticks through his tongue and put it on display outside the Senate. A very clear message to anybody who speaks out against the state.
That's probably what's going to happen to me here at Cornell.
I was reading this old book, Sam, about the Oxford Union, about the whole Oxford debate.
Yeah.
And it was written in like the 1950s by somebody who was like at Oxford in the like 1920s.
Yeah.
And they were talking about somebody from the 19th century who remembered a time when there was a hill at the Oxford campus where they would hang the undergraduates for disobedience. Like if they violated university policy, they would be executed on campus. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
He'd be like, yeah, I remember looking at my office window and I could see the bodies of the undergraduates swaying on the gallows. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, you thought J-Board was serious. Man, this is like a real thing. I looked it up. I was like, that guy had to be drunk. I looked, it was a real thing, like because it was like they had that kind of authority in the old medieval university days.
It's sort of interesting. So if you go to Oxford, then we'll get back on track. But
Yeah.
if you go to Oxford, there's Oxford University, and then there's the Oxford Union. And Oxford Union is like this nice building that's been around forever, right next to Oxford University, but it's not part of Oxford University. And it was built because they wanted to have debates about like the existence of God and such, but they wouldn't let them do it on campus. Where they're like, well, we're not going to have this blasphemy, these kind of debates. So some of the undergraduates are like, we kind of want to have these religious debates. So one of the students that had been kicked out of Oxford gave all the money to build the Oxford Union. And even today, the Oxford Union is not part of the Oxford University. It's just right next. But everybody joins the Oxford Union. It's kind of like joining the student union. But it's not part of the university. So so we have like a student union on our campus based after that, but it's owned by the university. At Oxford itself, it's a separate thing. They're separately incorporated. So the Oxford Union, even to this day, has three things. It has administrative offices where they have like 4 employees. One of the employees is important for the second thing they have a bar, right? And one of the employees is a bartender. Like they're the same bartender, so that's one of their key employees. And then the third thing they have is a place to have debates and open discussions. That's why you always think it's sometimes mistakenly called the Oxford Debate Union.
Oh, that's right.
But it's really called the Oxford Union. And so those are the three things. The guy that gave the money was kicked out of Oxford. He sounds like he might have been one of these guys that might have gotten hung in previous days. But violated a very important rule of Oxford. He kept racehorses.
Ooh.
And they had a rule that if you're a student here, you can't own racehorses because that's considered like a terrible.
It will corrupt your soul, man.
Yeah, exactly. And so they told him, you either got to give up the racehorses or leave Oxford. And he's like, I'm out here.
Yeah.
When was this?
In the 1800s, early 1800s. But they probably were swinging much earlier than that from the gallows.
Oh yeah, much earlier.
Yeah.
It wasn't the 19th century, but there were people alive who remembered
Yeah.
that time in the 19th century. Pretty wild, huh? Okay, so moving on from that, we're getting into much more modern time. Well, more modern than that. We have here. This is a really super dramatic and awesome portrait of St. Augustine. You know St. Augustine?
Man, he looks like a superhero.
He looks like he could be. It's like Mel Gibson or something. He's ready for Mission Impossible, Mission Rhetoric. Here we go. And he's even got like a fan, some devoted person over here, like praying to him. So he was a early bishop and early priest of the Catholic Church, and he was one of the early ones who said it is not pagan, and it is not. He was a convert to Christianity; he wasn't born into it. And he says it's not pagan; it's not against God to use the things that exist in order to bring more people to God. So using ancient texts is not using the devil's work, right? Looking at these ancient, all these things I've been talking about, they had access to these texts. And, the ones that survived, right? The Alexandria Library destruction. There's lots of texts that are missing because of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which is a great historical event you should be familiar with. But he said, using these things don't go against God, we can use them to serve God. So he's sort of a follower of this idea of this definition of rhetoric. Identifying all available means of persuasion to give an instance. We can use these things to bring people to God. Let's use them. That seems like what God would want. And that was his whole thing. He also wrote several famous books. In Confessions, he talks about how much of a struggle it is to be Christian, since he came to it later in life. And he has the famous line, "Oh Lord, make me honest and make me pure, and I'll do all these things immediately, and make me chaste, but not yet." Now he's still struggling. But he said rhetoric was the art of teaching, pleasing, and moving, which still holds up today. Now, this is a very interesting definition of rhetoric. It comes from St. Augustine, who writes about rhetoric. He wrote several books, Confessions, the most famous, where he talks about being a rhetoric teacher in Italy and how terrible the students were. They just didn't do their assignments. They didn't read. They didn't pay attention to him.
Preach it, brother.
Yeah. It's like nothing changes. Like you go read this stuff, you're like, sounds like my life, dude. You know, it's really funny. Then over here, this is Sir Francis Bacon. This also might be in the book as far as the definitions of the book go along with
And he invented bacon.
He invented bacon, as you can see. He's looking at some off camera.
No, he didn't invent bacon. Don't write that.
Yeah. Francis Bacon is a very famous early scientist and thinker in the age of reason, age of enlightenment. And he said that rhetoric was the application of reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will. This is a very cool definition. What do you think it means? How would you re-say it in modern terms? It was like Old English.
The applications of reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will.
Yep.
Critical thinking.
Critical thinking, can you say a little bit more about it?
I don't know, like questioning what you're told and applying what you know to what somebody tells you.
Good.
That's a good definition.
Yeah. Anybody else? How would you say that? How would you say this in your oops? How would you say this in your own words? Yeah.
Painting a clearer picture in someone's head.
Yeah, painting a clear picture in someone's head. Very good.
By the way,
Oh, go ahead, Sam.
by the way, you probably heard of Sir Francis Bacon in some other ways. There's some conspiracies concerning him. Does anybody know the most famous one? Anybody? Just want to guess.
That he wrote Shakespeare.
Yes.
Mhm.
That he is really Shakespeare. And then he couldn't admit it because he was a fancy dude, right, with a lot of prestige. And he couldn't write these body-like plays.
Yeah, like
So-
entertainment for the people.
So he found some actor, this guy Will Shakespeare, and then he's like, here, I've done a little writing, you take credit. And people are like, why would he do that? And they're like, he don't want to give up his day job. And acting is considered like a lower thing for a fancy guy like him.
Yeah, it would be like finding out. That's a really good point because it would be like finding out that like Aaron Sorkin was writing these like ridiculous poop-oriented cartoons, like that were airing for people, like a horse and a pig poop on each other and laugh, and it's like everybody likes his dumb humor. But like Aaron Sorkin's like, I can't have my name attached to that, but I really, really want to write it, like this body sort of people's entertainment. So you just make up another name, right? Or if like J.K. Rowling was writing like these ridiculously like teen supernatural romance like novels,
What's the guy with the Eric?
Like Harry Potter's like fine literature,
cartoon with Eric and the one where they're like little bad, they're little like cartoon-like figures. They're on TV. No, Eric, they're cartoons. Eric.
South Park.
South Park.
Oh yeah.
It'd be like finding out some famous author.
Like J.K. Rowling's writing South Park.
Yeah.
You'd be like, what? Like it would color your view of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Like, how nice that is, how good that is. So that's considered to be like really pretty highbrow stuff nowadays. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it'd be like that. So moving forward through time, this is a person who, this is a picture of Peter Ramus, who was a French scholar of rhetoric or philosophy. And he's seen as the person who sort of ended the glory days of rhetoric. All this stuff where rhetoric is sort of at the center of learning and teaching. He's the person who said that rhetoric really should not be in the center of the university. At best, rhetoric is a delivery mechanism for truths that are learned elsewhere and knowledge that's created elsewhere. So you have a sense from these earlier people that one can learn through rhetoric and one can create knowledge through rhetoric. Like a lot of modern theories of knowing would say that knowledge is not an object or a thing, but it's constituted through social action, social interaction. Post-structuralists and postmodernists. Right? So these theories are sort of sort of predecessor. These old rhetoric theories are predecessor of that term, I would say. Where the sophists are saying, look, you can take speech, you can sort of make anything true if you do it well. Like Gorgias is saying, that truth is a constituted phenomenon, not a discovered phenomenon. That's very hard for us to accept, coming out of the long age of modernism, right? Where truth is something we discover through good tools. And we're kind of bucking up against that in contemporary controversies, right? Global climate debate, the anti-vaccination debate. There's lots of them. Lots of these kind of debates floating around in our world, yes? And these are all sort of pushing up against the limits of modernism's ability to describe the world to us persuasively, or to discover what's true and right and good, which is what we've all learned is that method. You apply method to the confusing and chaotic world, you'll discern what's coming out of it true. The sophists and other ancient rhetoricians would say, out of the chaotic world you can constitute anything through the method of rhetoric. You can constitute a world and constitute truths and constitute facts and constitute reasons. And Ramus said, this is really bad. I agree with Plato. Rhetoric is really not something that should be around. Instead, we should have philosophy, which will determine through dialectic what's true and what's good and what's appropriate. And rhetoric might be sort of polishing it up to make sure people can understand you. So he's the one, Peter Ramus is the one who sort of returns us to a rhetoric of form without substance. Like it's the right kind of words. And you can see his long reach. This is like the 1600s that Ramus is working. And he's killed in Huguenot battles in Paris. He's killed, he's up at his office grading papers, and there's a big riot. It's St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in French history. There's a big riot going on. He's grading papers, and they break into his office, and they're like, kill him! And he's like, ah! And he has to defend himself, and then they throw him out the window of his office.
And then,
sad way to die.
I understand, maybe I heard this wrong, that it was the students.
Yeah, it could have been the students, yeah.
So it's always a cautionary tale.
Mm-hmm.
Bring it.
Sam's ready. He's ready about this.
I'll be up in my tower in the 6th floor, and you guys go.
Yeah.
No Peter Ramus.
Try to throw somebody out of these windows. Good luck.
We're on the bar floor.
But anyway, this was a big turn. And actually, if you look at 19th century, even early 20th century speech books, they'll have this conception of rhetoric still there, which is the conception that rhetoric is sounding good. Go and do your research and find the facts from other fields, and then present it well. This is a very different conception of rhetoric than the way the ancient Greeks thought about it, which was the constitution of information, not the presentation and transmission of information. So you have a transmission model of rhetoric versus a constitutive, or to use a big fancy word that you might have encountered in a philosophy class, an epistemic model of rhetoric, which is something that we'll get to in a few minutes because people have taken that on as well. The constitution of knowledge, epistemology, the study of knowing, kind of a cool thing to study, is how do we know things, and also the question, what counts as knowledge? A big question for philosophers such as Michel Foucault and others. What counts as knowledge? What does it mean to know something? How do you know when you read something that it's knowledge? Where does that knowledge come from? You weren't taught directly. This is knowledge, this isn't it. But we all know knowledge when we see it. And for Foucault, this was an incredibly engaging question. And he wrote many books about it. And for other scholars too, what does it mean to know something? And for a lot of postmodernist and post-structuralist thinkers, knowledge is constituted socially, culturally, and of the moment. So what we think is great knowledge today, like DNA, for example, that we think is amazing, because it identifies genetic predisposition for disease and provides treatment. It allows people to, and probably in the future, select what their baby's going to be like. That's a big ethical debate, right? What eye color, hair color, all that stuff. It also allows for us to exonerate people of crimes, yeah? So we have the Innocence Project, which is going doing DNA testing on old crimes before there was DNA testing. In a couple of hundred years, DNA testing may be laughable. There might be a class happening here in 200 or 300 years where the professor's like, and then they believed in DNA. And all the students are like, yeah, I know. Can you believe they believe that? Now we know that, zephrons are the thing, and zephrons are present and excreted by the body. And everyone can be, you can just use the zephron tracker and you can know where everyone is at any point in time. That might be what it's like. I don't know. Think about how weird DNA would be.
This will be on the test.
Think about how weird DNA is. Or even a more simple thing, like Jack the Ripper. You familiar with the Jack the Ripper case? 1880s, Whitechapel, London. What do you know about Jack the Ripper?
It's a serial killer.
Huh?
Was it a serial killer?
Serial killer? One of the earliest serial killers?
May not have existed.
May or may not have existed.
He killed prostitutes. Yeah.
He killed prostitutes?
Like
Yeah.
to cut them open, look at their organs or something.
Yeah, he would cut them open and leave them in these weird cut open positions for the detectives to
A
find.
lawyer or dentist or something.
He had some surgical knowledge. Because he removed a kidney from one prostitute, and then a week later mailed it to the lead detective at Scotland Yard, and it was removed with surgical precision. So the Scotland Yard detective was like, never got a kidney in the mail before, but this tells us this person knows how to use a scalpel. They're probably a medical student or a surgeon. They'll narrow the field. There's very little blood at the crime scenes, right? Maybe like 2 or 3 shot glasses of blood at the crime scenes. They were what? Killed somewhere else. Pretty interesting, right? But here's the one thing about it when you go and look at Ripper stuff, is the Ripper left big big, giant, bloody handprints everywhere. Why couldn't they catch him?
No fingerprint.
Fingerprint technology did not exist. The way you caught a criminal was an eyewitness, or through police detective work, interviews, interrogation of suspects through the police, to get the evidence that then you could take to court. They did not have fingerprints. 1888. So think about what we don't have. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about. All of your best knowledge, all of the best things our society knows, all the best things we come up with, are going to be the butt of the jokes of the students in 1,000 years. Easily. Maybe even less. Pretty cool, huh? It kind of takes the pressure off of college, yeah? I'm learning a dead and obscure knowledge to someone in like 500 years. It's kind of cool to think about. But the coolest thing about all that is I didn't present you with any facts, any evidence, any citation, but it feels real. It's the power of rhetoric, right? I said all that stuff. You buy it. It moves you. This is the real power of rhetoric, because I created an entire cosmology there for you. Just with my words. I didn't pull out a book. I didn't show you statistic.
You did cite one thing. You said, look back 100 years, and that can help us understand 100 years from now.
Yeah, that's evidence, right?
Yeah.
It sounds good, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Ramus, this perfect rhetoric would be have no rhetoric at all.
Mhm.
Have you ever heard the phrase, that's just rhetoric? Or, you know,
Yeah.
I don't buy bullshit and other rhetoric and that sort of thing.
You hear it a lot with a particular presidential candidate, yes?
Yeah.
Right now.
Right. So that's
Is
what I
Donald
think-
Trump's rhetoric harmful?
So how do you think I feel when I'm at one of these fancy smancy faculty meetings and they're like, what do you teach? Neuroscience. What do you teach? Weatherology. What do you teach? Something else ology. I'm like, what do you teach? Rhetoric. They're like, yeah, bullshit professor.
Yeah.
I might as well say, I teach rhetoric.
Yeah, the fine art of bullshit. Rhetoric. So yeah, the old saying goes that Sam is alluding to is if philosophy is the queen of the studies at the university, what is rhetoric? The harlot, right? That's the way the Ramessites would talk about it.
Yeah.
They're like, it's just cheap, no loyalty, does whatever for money. But the queen, the philosophy is like, oh no, that's below me. I can't eat your Pop-Tarts. I require finer food. I can't get into your compact car. It's like, I am special. So that's sort of the difference.
And they're like, oh, don't you have any ethics at all? You just teach them to say whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, damn right.
I mean, for what I would say, it depends on the situation, what I would say to that question. Like, do you teach ethics? And it depends on who I'm talking to, what I would say and how I would say it. So it's like a real commitment to sort of the rhetorical ethic, right? It's like, well, show me the audience and I'll show you what I would say.
And they're like, you mean you have situational ethics you change depending on who you talk to?
I have situational ethics if saying that would be persuasive to my audience. Do you
Wow.
understand?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're the worst. Like, you don't stand for anything. You stand for whatever it takes. Hashtag.
I stand for hashtag.
Yeah.
Hashtag whatever it takes. I should redo this and put hashtags in here.
They would understand it more.
So, anyway, after Ramus, a couple hundred years go by of just this sort of flowery rhetoric, or they call it sort of rhetoric of just packaging. It's like if the study of rhetoric was like economics, and then it was reduced to just how to wrap gifts at Christmas. That's what Ramus did. He just sucked all the air out of the room. And then, around in the 18th century, about 100 years, maybe 50, 80 years later, this was brought to a fine form in the Scottish Enlightenment. And this is George Campbell here. He said that rhetoric is that art or talent by which discourse is adapted to its end. So you can see, comparing this with Aristotle, what do you think? And comparing this with the Aristotle definition, which is the one that you should memorize and always have at the tip of your tongue, and which is the identification of all available means of persuasion in any given situation. That's the Aristotle definition. How does that mesh or contradict, or how does that speak to Campbell's understanding? How would you put those two into conversation? Should I put the Aristotle one back up?
Yes. And then we'll force them to come with an answer.
book considered like an art again, as
Mhm.
opposed to the previous one, or he thinks rhetoric?
Yeah, it needs to be eliminated.
Yeah.
It's like a false science. I mean, in those days, they called every subject that we would call a discipline, they called it a science. There's kind of a different way. So, or a department. It would be called the sciences of. That's just a holdover from medieval universities. That's very good. Yeah, they're both sort of an art again. What else? Yeah.
Aristotle was more about identifying, while this is more about like maybe the practical application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a lot more practical. Although it might be practical to identify, it's much more of saying, I'm practicing the art if I just say, for this speaker in this speech, look at all the things they could do. Which a lot of rhetoricians do that. Modern rhetoricians do that. They'll say, Obama has to give this speech. Here are the 8 possible good things he could do. And they'll write a paper on that. So, yeah. And this is much more practical. It's like, okay, so how do we adapt our speech to its purpose? Very practical. Very practical.
This is like get her done.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That'd be a good hashtag for that.
Yeah.
I'll just put Larry the Cable Guy here instead of Campbell next time. So now we come to Cornell University in the 1930s. And this is a lovely picture of an English professor, Herbert A. Wilhelms, who was an English professor, trained in literary criticism, and this is the birth of modern rhetoric happened right here at Cornell University.
Just right over there on the art squad.
Yeah, which is what we call the birth of rhetoric happens in what we call the Cornell School of Rhetoricians. It's kind of cool that you're at this historical place. It's kind of cool for me to come here and talk about rhetoric at a place that no longer has a rhetoric department, at the place where the study, my genealogy of where I came from, my study comes from Wilhelms, right? Like my professors were educated by people who were educated by people who were educated by people from the Cornell School. Wilhelms and his court of scholars, right?
And
they went out and spoke, he taught people, they went to different universities, he spread rhetoric. And he said, he was like, if literature is important enough to be critically studied, like literary criticism, like Matthew Arnold kind of stuff, shouldn't we do the same thing for political speeches? Isn't that also valuable? And it wouldn't be literary criticism. We'd have to do something else. It would have to be different. And he wrote a great essay called Towards the Literary Criticism of Oratory, which founded modern rhetoric, founded the Cornell School. And this is the quote about rhetorical criticism. It's necessary and analytical. Throughout such a study, one must conceive of the public man as influencing the men of his own times by the power of his discourse. It's a very famous quote justifying the study of it. Because this is how we get things done. This is how we move people. This is how we share ideas. And he split. He and the Cornell School started the split from the National Councils of the Teachers of English to the National Association of the Teachers of Speech, which exists today as the National Communication Association, which has an annual conference with over 4,000 to 5,000 attendees who share papers on rhetoric, speech, communication, scholars from all on the teaching of it, on the criticism of it, on the practice of it, on the theory of it.
And Steve and I are both members. Are you a member?
I'm a member, yeah.
Yeah, so am I.
Are you going this year?
No.
Oh, too bad.
Where is it this year?
Vegas, baby!
Okay, I am. So,
we can take your winnings and pay for the great hotel suite I've gotten for all of us.
Okay, yeah.
For me and my
Last time
buddies.
we were in Chicago, you did let me stay in your place.
That was a funny trip. We'll tell you the story later.
So,
Wilhelms, founder of the feast.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Wilhelms is, so today at Cornell, where do you learn about rhetoric? The place that started it all, gigantic, nationwide, worldwide thing, started here at Cornell in the 1930s. Where at Cornell do you study rhetoric?
From you.
This is the only place that rhetoric is taught.
Mm-hmm.
This little basement, dungeon-like classroom is the last remnant at Cornell.
You think they'd be proud of this heritage, you know?
Perhaps. I mean, he's my hero. I mean, years after they fire me, I'll still be sneaking around trying to teach rhetoric in this place.
Wilhelms retired in the 1960s. I should have brought it with me.
Yeah.
He retired in the 1960s, and scholars from all over the U.S. who were either taught by him or influenced by his fundamental essay sent in essays for a memorial volume that was published by Cornell University Press to be presented as a gift to him. On the occasion of his retirement, they published a few hundred of them. I have one of these copies of this book.
Nice.
It's a very cool thing to have.
Yeah, and the thing about Wilhelms is, so there's this famous thing, the Cornell School of Rhetoric. But he famously hated all administrators at Cornell. He's like, they are dumb as rocks, right? So he's like, and they don't understand what I'm doing. So I'm not going to ask for their permission. I'm just going to find some friends that also teach at Cornell, and we're just going to call ourselves the Cornell School of Rhetoric. But he never got approval for anybody. He just taught in different departments. At one time there was a department of oratory, he taught there. There was a department of speech and theater, he taught in that. There was a department, he was in the Department of English for a while. They got tired of him because he was talking about speech and rhetoric all the time, and they're like, no, it's the written word, you're out of here. So he kept on getting moved all around the university. But he was like, I don't care where you put me because I'll still have the Cornell School of Rhetoric. And they're like, we don't recognize that. He goes, that's too bad because everybody else does. And people would come here during his time, you know, he taught up into the 1960s, and they're like, can you point out what building the Cornell School of Rhetoric is? And it didn't exist. He and his friends are just like, we'd like to be called the Cornell School of Rhetoric. It would be like if I started the Cornell School of Cosmetology, you know, beauty school, Cornell Beauty School, and it became very famous, and people came to Cornell and they're like, I would like to learn from the top hairdressers. Where is the Cornell School of Beauty? And they're like, it doesn't really exist. They're like, well, where's Professor Nelson? Oh, he's an ILR. And then I found like a few other professors around in other departments, and we just called ourselves like the Cornell Beauty School. He did the same thing with the Cornell School of Rhetoric. And it became world famous, and everybody assumed it was like recognized in like a big building and everything, but he was just running it out of his like office with like some friends that he got together. It's like an interesting thing. What is the problem, by the way, with his strategy of the Cornell School of Rhetoric?
It didn't exist after he left.
Yes. It was strong as long as he was there to do it, but after he left, there was no one to keep it going.
You brought it back.
I'm bringing it back, slow but sure.
Yep, the
Right.
Neo-Cornellian School
Yes.
of Rhetoric.
And I've just named Professor Yano the dean.
Oh, awesome.
New Cornell School.
What's the pay?
Yeah, there's no pay.
Awesome, okay,
We're not
excellent.
concerned about filthy
Right,
lucre.
you're not distracted by material possessions. You're enlightened.
But isn't that wild that the
It is
guy
wild.
started a whole famous thing? Just
I like to think of it as the great, classic, very important art film, Bloodsport, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, where he has to search Thailand for the Kumite, the underground lethal boxing club that he wants to be the champion of. That's kind of the way I see Sam.
Searching.
Sort of like a young Jean-Claude Van Damme,
Thank you.
ready to fight, ready to battle to the death for rhetoric at
But-
Cornell.
Now, no one knows about this guy, Will Collins. Have
No.
you ever heard of him beforehand? No, now you must go.
If you type his name into Google, you'll get his essay. You can read it. It's a really good background on rhetoric. And also, it's important to note that sometimes the Cornell School is referred to as the Neo-Aristotelians. Neo is a Greek word. It means new. Very ancient Greek word. It means new. Which might change your view of the Matrix. I don't know. But Neo means new. And he and his friends found Aristotle's rhetoric. They didn't know about any of this other stuff that you know about. They went from here all the way into the 20th century. And they were like, Aristotle's book shows us what we need to know. Aristotle's book, The Rhetoric, shows us what we need to do the literary criticism of oratory. What's involved in that? Things that literary criticism doesn't consider. Audience, situation, purpose, method. Literary criticism has some of those things, but one of the things literary criticism wasn't interested in the 1930s was audience. The meaning was located somewhere else. Like when you read a book, like a favorite novel, where's the meaning? This is an incredibly important question, and the way you answer it will align you with one faction in a giant battle over meaning that's been happening for thousands of years. Where's the meaning? Or, if you like art, go to an art museum, you look at a painting, where's the meaning? Or if you like music, favorite song comes on. Ah, I love this song. Where's the meaning? I'm one of these stupid people who I have people over and I'll play my playlist. And it's like my playlist I made. But every song comes on, I'm like, oh, I love this song. I was like, well, duh. Like, who makes a playlist of songs I hate? Like, it doesn't make any sense. I don't know why I do that. But my friends make fun of me. Because I'm like, oh, I love this song. And they're like, dude, this is your Pandora that we're listening to. I was like, oh yeah, okay, sorry. Oh, I love this song too. Shh, everybody be quiet. So where's the meaning? How many of you say the meaning is in the book or the song or the painting? You raise your hand. Okay. How many of you say the meaning is in the artist who created it? Okay. How many of you say the meaning is in you looking at it or listening to it? Oh, wow. You're all wrong. No. How many of you say the meaning is in the moment of encounter? Yep. And how many of you say the meaning is located when you articulate your experience to someone else?
Ooh, I like that.
You know, why do you like that horrible band? Nickelback is awesome. They're so musically talented. Are you on drugs? Do you have any drugs?
By the way, Emma, Gideon, and Juliet are going to be giving a whole lecture on the neo-Aristotelian criticism on September 28th if you'd like to come back.
I'll be here with bells on, man. I'd love to learn about the neo-Aristotelians from some sharp young Cornell students.
It will make Wilcombs proud. I think.
That's great.
His ghost maker.
Yeah. It's cool. Yeah. Yeah, but he didn't realize how big he was on. He started a whole study. I mean, the NCA exists because of this guy and his thoughts, right? So it's a small question, but an honest one, and he asked it seriously. And I mean, you can do the same thing. He's just a dude, you know. So then we move into modern rhetoric, 20th century rhetoric.
Does that first dude look like a comedian?
This is presidential candidate Bernie Sanders.
No, it's not Bernie Sanders. It's Bob.
This is Reginald Sanders. This is actually I.A. Richards, British philosopher and poet.
He looks British.
And he said rhetoric should be the study of miscommunication and its remedies. In fact, he said, if you think you're studying communication, you're wrong. What you're actually studying is miscommunication. Because it's not interesting to study the times when it works. Like if I ask you, I say, hey, could you go open the door? And you're like, okay, and you do it. It's like communication, successful. People don't write books about this. People write books about like Hurricane Katrina. Like the government communicating with New Orleans, with the local, like huge failures, right? People talk about that kind of stuff. So he said, why don't we just call it that? And then my department at St. John's was just recently formed, like in 2008. The dean split us off from speech science. So okay, you're all rhetoricians and communication scholars. What should we name the department? And I said, we should follow I.A. Richards and call it the Department of Miscommunication. And they were all laughed, and I'm like, I'm serious. And then I brought I.A. Richards' books and stuff to the next meeting, and then everyone thought I was like serious and like mentally ill.
Yeah, because that would be the worst name.
What would be awesome? What is
miscommunication? I'm a miscommunication.
How many of you would take a class that was at the Department of Miscommunication? Would that intrigue you? Would that interest you?
Yeah.
Isn't it much more interesting? Well, how much can we learn from success and how much can we learn from failure? That's the question.
Are you a communication major? No, I'm miscommunication.
I'm a miscommunication major, and then it starts like, what? What is that? Well, I'm sorry, I misheard you. What? I.A. Richards was also a person who invented emoticons, but not really. He thought that in written text, it was hard to tell if someone's being sarcastic or joking, or if they're actually angry. Have you had this experience on text message? Where somebody's actually angry at you and you're like, LOL, winky face. Like, no, I'm really pissed right now. It's like, yeah, sure you are. And then you're like, it's like, when you see that person in real life, it's like nuclear war, right? It's like bad news, and you're like caught flat-footed. Or you try to be sarcastic, and somebody like bursts into tears. They call you like, why are you being so mean? I was just joking. So he was like, this is a real problem. So he came up with his own script of like putting little superscripts at the bottom of words. You know what I'm talking about? Like if you know math or chemistry, you know, like a little subscript to say this is sarcastic. You put a little at the end of the sentence or at the end of the phrase. Or like this is ironic. You put a little I. That was his idea. But I don't know. Doesn't that like imagine if you read stuff and it was all marked ironic, sarcastic. This is a joke. It might strip it away. This is the contemporary debate in literature departments about trigger warnings. Are you guys familiar with this? Like trigger warnings. So some books deal with very serious themes: sexual assault, abuse, violence, and some people in these classes have experienced these things themselves, and they are triggers for psychological disturbances. We have a lot of people coming out of the university who have been soldiers. Who've been soldiers for a very long time in very difficult situations. I've had tons of soldiers at St. John's in my class. I wouldn't know that they had been, like one guy, he came up, he gave a speech. He was on 4 Iraq tours in Iraq. He gave a speech about that. Pretty crazy. But there's certain things for him that are triggers. that kind of freak him out. So the trigger warning idea is before you're going to read a novel that engages these kind of things, you warn the class what's coming. Like this novel deals with sexual assault. This novel deals with extreme violence against minority people. This novel deals with child abuse. This novel deals with rape. And you give the trigger warning. But some people say that's very good because it helps people prepare for what they're going to study. Some people say it's bad because those people don't read it because they're scared and it might not be as bad as they think. And it also spoils the book and it spoils the experience of literature. So that's a big debate happening right now on every university campuses. Are trigger warnings appropriate? How to do them well? They seem infinitely regressive. Like if I'm going to trigger a warning about rape, I need to trigger warning my trigger warning that I'm going to talk about rape, and then I need to trigger warning that, right? So that's one argument that I've heard. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. I think it's kind of silly. But there's lots of other claims in that. It's the same kind of thing that he was talking about back in the 1930s and 40s. And he wrote a lot of weird plays and weird poems. I love it. I have it all in my house. I bring it out every so often. I'm like, oh, do you want to read something really weird? I bring out his stuff. It's so cool.
So, Steve, before we get on to Kenneth Burke, why don't we take a little break?
Sure, yeah. Whatever is good.
Break, go use the bathroom, do what you do, and come back in 5 minutes. I wanted to bring him, but Steve said no.
Not true. If you were like, let's bring baked goods and coffee, I'd be like, yes. I love coffee. I drink way too much coffee.
In fact, we had a bunch of it before we came.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
My doctor said at one point, he's like, you can only have 2 cups of coffee a day. And now the research has changed. Now he's like, you could have up to 5 or 6. It's actually quite good for you. So I'm like, great. Yeah.
Is it true that the half-life of caffeine lasts like weeks? Like caffeine's in your system for so long?
I think that's uranium.
It's funny. I wish we had a device that would answer it for us, but alas, we have no such device.
I in fact check your computer.
Yeah, right. Just type in Google half-life of caffeine.
5 to 6 hours.
5 to 6 hours. Is that what it says? That's not so bad. Do you believe her?
I don't have a laptop on me.
It's on the internet. It must be true.
Must be true.
So that's an interesting qualification whether he believes her or not. Nothing about her voice, nothing about the way she said it. But I don't have a laptop with me. I don't have the codex. I need the codex.
She gave me good eye contact, though.
Yeah. She seemed pretty authoritative. I didn't even know you looked it up. I was going to ask you if you were like a nutrition major or something.
No, she's a well-known
She's like,
liar.
5 6 hours. 5 6 hours. Case closed. It's like the way people say things might be as important to the content as the content. This is something that's important for Burke, right? Like the tone of something. Like, hey, are you going to the party this weekend? Hey, are you going to the party this weekend? Are you going to the party this weekend? Right? Now, the propositional content of that statement is the same. But the 3 different meanings, yeah? And if we played with it, we could come up with probably 5 or 6 more. There's an old Seinfeld episode about this, right? I don't know if you guys watch Seinfeld. It might be too old for you. You know, like it's kind of ancient now. Any of you guys watch Seinfeld? I love it. There's one where Jerry's dentist is having a party and invited all his friends, but not him. And so whenever the dentist talks about it, he's like, how do you say it? He's like, is Jerry coming to the party? Is Jerry coming to the party? It's all about this. The whole episode is about this. He's trying to figure out if he's invited or not. And this is one of the things Burke talks about. Kenneth Burke is one of the most prolific, broad, weirdest dudes. Lived his life in New Jersey. He was a poet, literary critic. He was involved in early 20th century literary criticism magazines in New York City. Amazing thinker. He came up with a whole cosmology or system of thought called dramatism, which instead of taking Shakespeare's like all the world is a stage kind of thing, he took it literally. He's like, drama isn't a reflection of life. Life is a reflection of what happens in the theater. We can learn about how to live from the theater. It's not like people have experiences write a play. Plays show us how humans interact. And we can create a whole theory of understanding human motives from the theater. That's what dramatism is. And part of his theory deals with rhetoric. He wrote 3 important books. One of them was not published, but the manuscript exists. But he decided not to publish it. We're not sure why. But when they went through his things after he died in 1993, they found the full manuscript. It had been sitting there for years. He should never publish it. Something was wrong with it. It wasn't quite ready. You can read it if you want. It's on the internet. So the books are the grammar of motives, the rhetoric of motives, and the symbolic of motives. Those are the 3 ways he thought about it. A grammar, a rhetoric, and a symbolic. So these hit a lot of the rhetoric definitions we're talking about. Grammar being like a system of meaning, system of coherent meaning that is universal. Like you understand me because I'm using proper grammar, or grammar that's at least close enough to being proper. One of the things we forget is grammar follows usage, right? So grammar is always after the fact. So a lot of times people's usage of a language will outstrip the grammar rules, and it will take a long time for the grammar rules to catch up. Rhetoric, persuasion, movement. These are his definitions of rhetoric. Is the realm of the subsidized lie. That's one of his definitions of rhetoric.
Yeah.
Pretty cool, huh? What does it mean to subsidize something? Like when the government subsidizes the cost of corn.
Artificial support.
Right, to artificially support, not market value. So rhetoric helps you subsidize your lies. Right? He calls it the scramble, the realm of cloaked malice. Which I think is pretty cool. And then rhetoric is forever proving opposites. Proving opposites, which I think, I don't know what you think, but that sounds very highly sophisticated to me. Like, I'm going to give you two opposites. In philosophy, what's it called? Is there any philosophy majors in here? Maybe. It's a cool thing to be. I don't want to, people are like, oh my God, I don't want to go through this again. What are you going to do? What kind of job are you going to have? I don't like it. So in philosophy, when you have two apparently true statements that are incommensurable, contradictory, you call it an aporia, right? An aporia, an unsolvable contradiction. And here's rhetoric is proving opposites. It's like rhetoric is the realm of creating these things, or proving the opposite is true. So you give me a thing, I'll prove you the opposite is true, and then I'll prove the opposite of that is true. That's kind of how he saw it. It was this art. And Kenneth Burke's idea of rhetoric comes from an incredibly famous thinker. There's only a few thinkers like this who come up with a theory that's so complete, so totalizing, so persuasive, that it purports to explain all human interaction. One of these people, the person that inspired Burke, is Sigmund Freud. You know anything about Sigmund Freud? He's one of these great thinkers who comes up with a theory that threatens to explain all human action under a single theory. There's a couple other thinkers like this. Can you name another one? Sigmund Freud? What's another big thinker like this who has a theory that possibly could explain all human interaction?
Marx?
Yeah, very good. Karl Marx. That's the other one.
Nietzsche?
Yeah, Nietzsche, perhaps. Yeah.
Kant. Immanuel Kant.
Maybe Kant. Yeah, we're getting there. But it's these people who have come up with such a broad and what we call ontological thought that you could explain almost any human interaction through their terms. And Freud is one of these people. What do we know about Sigmund Freud? It's okay if you, whatever you know is probably good. I mean, don't. I'm not going to be like, get her out of here. It's wrong. Sam, throw her out. Oedipus, what's the Oedipus complex?
That like when you're young, you think of your opposite sex parent in like a sexual way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, pretty good. The Oedipus complex is that the child fantasizes about replacing the authority figure in the home with themselves, disposing of them, wishing them away, and taking that place, and being one of the two parents, whichever one the child thinks is in charge. Could be the dad. Often, I mean, in 19th century Vienna, in early 20th century Vienna, it's probably the dad, which is where Freud's practicing. But it's the fantasy of the youth to be in charge of the house. If I was the dad, like you ever play house with a kid? This is the Oedipus complex.
Isn't this whole thing now like sexual? Isn't that,
Yeah. Yeah. So the two big things that Freud came up with theories, which are radical even to us, they make us uncomfortable today, right? Are your motives are not known to you. Your mind is not fully known to you. You don't know everything that you're thinking and everything that's driving you. And you are at the core of you sexual. Those are Freud's two big insights. So he's the inventor. Think about this. This is going to blow your mind. He's the inventor of a theory called the theory of the unconscious. Like that didn't exist. He's the guy who's coming. He's like, your mind is not your own. There are things driving you to say and do things that you don't have access to. We call it the unconscious mind. And people are like, what? He's like, oh yeah. Happens. It motivates a lot. Think about times when you're meant to say something and you slip and say another word.
Freudian slip.
Freudian slip, very good, which he called the parapraxis. That was his term for it. The Freudian slip. Like when you say, I can't wait for class to begin, but you actually say, I can't wait for class to end. Oh, didn't mean to say that. It's like when unintended desire that was not aware to you comes out.
One time, and I swear this is not a Freudian slip, but I was accused of it. I said to this guy and girl that just won a debate tournament, now that you've had, I meant to say, now that you've had success,
Yeah, this is a good one.
I expect you to do really well. Instead, I said, now that you've had sex, right? And they're like, Freudian slip. And then one of the girls said, how did you know we had sex? And I'm like, it was a slip of the tongue. They're like, according to Freud, no such thing. Your unconscious brain said what was really on your mind.
Yeah. The question of whether it's really on your mind is controversial with Freud. He's like, you can't access the unconscious, but the unconscious is structured like a language. And unconscious desire comes out in the most innocent and simple of things. Dreams. In dreams, you get coded expression of desire that you've pushed away because it's inappropriate. And then he wrote a whole book called The Interpretation of Dreams.
Have you ever had that really weird dream and you're like, that was the weirdest dream ever? And then you can remember it, so you tell somebody, and they're like, that was a strange dream.
But Freud's more interested in the dreams that haunt you. The ones that you don't tell other people about, that you remember. You're like, why did I dream that? And it freaks you out. And it bothers you all day, and you don't dare tell anyone about it. Even though it seems innocent or just weird, there's something about the symbols in it that you recognize as being forbidden in some way.
Taboo.
Taboo, exactly. That's the word Freud used. Right? Very interesting guy, Freud. He would have been famous had he not come up with this because he was a medical doctor. And he and his partner were looking for new drugs to use in surgery to numb pain, to allow certain new anesthetics, right? Is that what they're called, anesthetics in surgery?
Yeah.
And they found a powder derived from a plant, a white powder derived from a plant that took pain away. And it was great. It's called cocaine. He's the discoverer of cocaine, which he used the rest of his life in small amounts. When he got nervous or when he was sleepy, like coffee.
He prescribed it to everybody.
Yep.
Anybody that would come to me and was like, here, try some of this white powder.
Yeah, to his
They're
friends.
like, oh, that's really good. You're a great doctor.
His patients, he said the way to cure madness or to cure insanity or to cure people who are having psychological trauma, they cry and everything, or what they call the hysterical woman, right? Is to talk to them. Whoa! Novel concept. Most of the time they'd lock them up and they say, you need to go to the sanitarium, dear, and they'd send them out to the country for like mineral baths and quiet time. But never in the world would anyone think to talk to a woman about what's bothering her. But Freud was like, if you talk to them, they already know what's wrong with them. And it's like, so how do you do this? Do you just explain what's wrong with them? No, you can't say very much at all. In fact, it's better if they don't see you. Just have them lay on the couch, and you sit, and you go, Say more about that. He called it the talking cure, which is the basis for modern therapy.
It was a strange thing. You're a doctor in Vienna, and everybody's used to walking into a normal doctor's office. But to him, you walk in, it's like a parlor.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one of these old-fashioned couches, you know, with the top end is a little higher than the bottom end, Victorian couches. And you would lay down on the couch, and he would sit at the part closest to your head, so you couldn't see him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would say, tell me what's on your mind, and then let you talk for a while.
Yeah.
It was only recently that they started saying, well, you get an hour to talk to your therapist, right?
The analytic hour.
More
Was
people.
like, yeah. That was one of Freud suggested.
Oh,
that,
was
the
he
analytic
one
hour?
hour?
Yeah.
1 hour?
But it was Jacques Lacan who came after him, the French psychoanalyst, who came up with the variable hour, which is if he thought the patient had rehearsed what they were going to say, like practicing for the therapist, like, what can I say for my therapist they would really like? Sometimes people in therapy do this. They like want to please the analyst. If Lacan suspected that, he'd be like, well, you'd be like, well, I was thinking, da-da-da. He'd be like, well, that's all the time we have this week. See you next week. Like, for like 5 minutes or something. People are like, what? He's like, bye. And then that way they come in like just completely open to talk about whatever. But he was not a normal therapist.
So are his theories like the foundation of like cognitive behavioral therapy, or is it different?
It draws on that. There's a lot. Freud was. That's a really deep question, but Freud's theories are influential there. But they don't take modern cognitive developmental theories. Don't draw exclusively from Freud. They draw from Piaget and other thinkers as well about childhood like sort of formation of the mind and things like that. And they have a debt to Freud, but they don't usually take all the Freudian corpus because there's a lot of codification there that it's sexist or that it's weirdly sexual or that he was this a cokehead who didn't have good ideas. And so Freud's dismissed a lot.
Yeah,
So he's really picked up a lot outside of psychology. In English departments, he's big. Like they use Freud a lot. English departments to talk about understanding what's going on in literature. Like accounting for human motives, which is what Kenneth Burke wanted to do. And Kenneth Burke was working at the time where Freud's work came into English through a writer who had some success you might have heard of called Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf loved Freud. She thought it was amazing. So she convinced her husband's brother, I guess her brother-in-law, she was like, we're going to print Freud in English and you're going to translate it. This guy, James Strachey. And Strachey was like, okay. So Freud came to London and they met and they came up with English terms for his German terms. And that's called the Standard Edition of Freud. So if you want to read Freud and talk to other people about it, you would read the Strachey edition. It's also called the Standard Edition. There's lots of translations, but I would recommend that one because that's when you're going to find the literature on Freud. The importance of Freud for rhetoric is multifold, but for Burke, it was the Oedipus complex. So this lady hit it right on the nail on the head here, saying the first thing she thought about Freud is the Oedipus complex, which is that the child wants to replace the authority figure. What kid doesn't want to do that? You ever play house with a kid, little kid? Like they're like, let's play house. You ever do this? Like, what do you get to be?
The dog.
Yeah, the dog or the kid. And what do they get to be? The mom or the dad. And then they give you arbitrary commands. Doesn't make any sense. Like, time for dinner, time for bed, time for a bath. This is how they see the world. It's a world full of arbitrary demands that they can do nothing about. Their life is not their own, and it's frustrating. This is what Freud said about. He had a very famous case of a little kid called Little Hans. You can go read the case. He has the script in there. Little Hans is the son of a famous symphony conductor in Vienna. He has this wonderful life. But little Hans is like really terrified of horses. So much so that his mom can't take him out because there's no cars in like he said, everyone's on a horse. So take little Hans out, he cries, he freaks out, he's scared of horses. Now it turns out that little Hans knows his dad's going away when the horses come, right? So he's like associating with. So Freud says this is the Oedipus complex. It's not something the child really wants to happen. But whenever little Hans' dad goes off on a symphony tour, they say, you're the man of the house now. You have to take care of mommy. You have to take care of your sister. And it's like the enactment of his greatest fantasy. Freud would say, if you got your greatest fantasy came true, it would freak you out. It would be horrifying as it would be pleasurable. Because it's not about getting the thing. It's about the struggle to get the thing is where pleasure comes from. That's what Freud said, right? It's not about acquisition. You have friends like that, and they're like, oh, he's so hot, she's so hot, I can't wait to date them. And then once they date them, it's like they break up a week later. Freud. It's like, well, thrill to kill. These kind of people.
The hunt.
The hunt. The hunt's more important, is more exciting than the kill. Right? And Freud would say that. So little Hans is freaked out because he's getting the culmination of the Oedipal fantasy is really happening to him. Everyone's like, you're in charge of the house now. He's like, oh, dear Lord, no. Like, I wanted it, but I don't want it, right? He's like, it freaks him out of it.
This is why, like, people that win the lottery, what do you know about people that win the lottery?
They quit their job and
They lose their money.
They become losers. They're like, it's like the worst thing that ever happened to them, right? A lot of them die in terrible accidents and stuff on, like, their new motorcycle.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Because they're like, shit, all my dreams have come true, now what do I do?
It was like self-sabotaging
I have no reason to
as well, right? Yeah.
Get me in my Lamborghini and I'll see how fast this thing goes and how fast it stops in a wall or something like that. Like they die terrible deaths.
Yeah, so all of this basically comes back to inspiration for Burke, because Burke is like, rhetoric is not about persuasion, it's about Oedipal identification. It's about wanting to be something you're not. And rhetoric is about identifying with that through words and through persuasion, moving yourself into line with the thing you want to be. Like, we are the same. And by that, you also simultaneously divide from everything the audience codes as not being identified with that figure of power or that person or that type. So we're all performing rhetoric all the time in the way we dress, the way we act. We want to be like certain things, or we want to convey certain messages. He says rhetoric is about identification and division. This is a huge shift from the previous thinkers that we've talked about. Giant shift, because now rhetoric is no longer confined just to oral speech. Yes? Now rhetoric can be art, rhetoric can be music, rhetoric can be the design of buildings, because buildings can identify and divide of certain things. Earlier, Sam said this room looked like a prison. Using rhetoric for you to identify this room as like some kind of detention facility. Right? I think it looks like a hospital. So we can say they're trying to identify this as institutional, we could argue. Like this room is rhetoric. Say paintings are rhetoric, art's rhetoric. The structure of a college campus is rhetorical because it wants you to identify the place you're at as a college campus. This is what Burke opened up for us. Very important. He wrote numerous books. If you go to the library, you won't find all his books in the same section. He has books in sociology, history, literature, anthropology, rhetoric, communication, psychology. He's everywhere. He's one of these people who really pushed the envelope on coming up with one of these grand and glorious motive theories like Sigmund Freud did. He's very influenced by Freud.
My favorite Sigmund Freud quote is this one. Tell me what you think it means. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. You know that quote?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what that's about?
Sometimes things are what they are.
Yeah, but why would he pick a cigar as just a cigar? It's phallic. He's right. A lot of people, his theory was a lot of people smoke cigars because they have homoerotic fantasies. And so men are associated with cigars. But it's really taboo, right, which is, Freud is all about studying the taboo, for a man to put a phallus in his mouth. But it's okay to put a cigar in your mouth. Well, how do you think this went over in 1900? Not so well. You know, all those guys smoking cigars, what they really want is a phallus in their mouth. And so he tried to defend himself by saying, okay guys, sometimes the cigar is just a cigar, and they all
Yeah, he wrote several books. One of the most famous, like The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. In that book, he talks about everyday life as being coded with all these kind of motives and things, and how sexual we are, and how pleasure-oriented we are, and how the things we do are motivated by things that we're not aware of. And it's very important to know if we want to stay healthy, if we want to help people get better. It's important to know these things. And that was sort of his argument. A lot of people in psychology don't follow him today, but there are a lot of Freudian analysts out there. A lot of Lacanians out there. Lacan changed a bit. And then there's lots of people who followed some of his other students, like Walcott, and then Karen Horney, who practiced in New York City, and Adler, a guy named, I forget his first name.
Mortimer.
Yeah, he was like, they all diverged from Freud in different ways and set up sort of different schools of psychological treatment. And Freud excommunicated everybody who broke with him, including Carl Jung, like his most cherished student. He's like writing him letters. He's like, much love, my friend, you know, like all this stuff, calling him dad and all this stuff. And then he came up with the theory of the archetype theory. And Freud's like, nope, it's strictly situational. You're out. You're out of my practice.
Yeah.
And
I meet people all the time, and they'll like identify themselves, and they're like, I'm a Jungarian. And I'm like, oh, Carl Jung? And they're like, yes, he is the greatest. Or, you know, you still meet Freudians every once in a while.
Oh yeah, there's a ton of them.
Yeah.
There's a lot, you know, so. Anyway, this brings us to rhetoric today, and the idea that rhetoric could be almost everywhere. Burke's sort of insight. Can you turn the backlight on, Sam?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, good. So the idea that rhetoric could potentially be everything and everywhere threatens rhetoric because it threatens to dissolve it into nothing, right? So if you say everything is psychological or everything is a poem, you sort of ruin the ability of that form to have any kind of meaning, right? So that's the threat to rhetoric. So I'm going to talk about some of the different ways people are doing rhetoric today. And I've broken it down into these things. There's traditional rhetoric, rhetoric of inquiry, rhetoric of space and place, visual rhetoric, and critical rhetoric. And then there are challenges to contemporary rhetorical scholarship. So now we're in the present day. There's a lot of people to talk about between Burke and the present day, but we just don't have time. I just thought I would leap from there. There's lots of people identify as Burkeans. If you went to NCA, you would find people who are like, I'm a neo-Aristotelian, like Wilhelms. You find a lot less Wilhelm-type people, a lot more Burkeans, or a lot more people who are like embraced critical theory, especially French critical theory, like Foucault or Desouteaux, Lacan.
There's a Kenneth Burke Society.
There is the Kenneth. Actually, yeah, you can look at the Kenneth Burke Society webpage if you want to. You can Google it, find out all about it.
Why did you put that visual?
Why
did you put that visual?
I don't know. I liked it. Rhetoric as sort of a diffuse term is kind of a threat. So, and plus it's a meme. So I've seen it before in different things. So, traditional rhetoric. These are scholars who do the thing that Wilhelm's was doing, which is looking at oral speeches, looking at mostly presidential scholarship, presidential rhetoric, and looking at the way people persuade either through classical rhetorics. There's classical rhetoricians who are looking at the history of it and doing work on the history of rhetoric, re-understanding it, just like a historian would for the Civil War or for colonization or the development of the industrial age. There are historians who are rhetoricians who are looking at the history of rhetoric and the history of all the understandings of this relationship, the different ways that this relationship can be formed. The presidential rhetoricians are dealing, there's a lot of Lincoln scholars out there, lots of other people who look at presidential speeches and what they can communicate. And then there's legal rhetorics, or rhetorics about the law, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, that kind of thing, where they're saying, here's how the Supreme Court is persuading us that this is what the law means. So there's a rhetoric to Supreme Court decisions. They're not just communications of what the law says. They are communications of what the law says because they are persuasive. They make you think that's what they are. So there's scholars doing that kind of work. Like the justices are deciding based on, whatever they think, but then they have to communicate it as if it was not their choice, right? The law says. And so there are rhetoricians who study that. So this kind of work is exceedingly popular. It's everywhere, and it's the Wilhelm's thing. It's looking at oral messages meant to persuade or meant to make you believe something or to do something and how they work.
I find this very interesting, the traditional rhetoric very interesting. So for example, the Supreme Court gets a case, and they split 5-4, right? And so the majority writes an opinion, and then the side that doesn't win, right, the minority writes an opinion. And it's like, you read them and you're like, did you guys hear the same case?
Yeah.
Right? It seems like two different things. And to study how they frame their arguments and their views is endlessly fascinating to me. Because they're all experts on the law. They're Supreme Court justices, right? They all went to the same 5 or 6 law schools, right? Some of them had the same professors, right? And you're like, how could you disagree so much about the same set of facts? And you're all applying to the same Constitution. What's going on here? And to read their different, the majority and the minority case is fascinating to me.
Okay. Next is rhetoric of inquiry, which is the rhetoric of studying things, I guess is a good way to put it. The rhetoric of asking questions, or the rhetoric of where knowledge sort of comes from. So you have rhetoric of science. There are people who study brain imaging. How is this persuasive or rhetorical? What does it mean when you see these brain images? Is that brain activity, or what is that? How do they convince us that that's what that is? So I have a friend who studies this stuff, and the coloration is added much, much later by a radiologist. The original image is shades of light gray and white. And the only thing that these brain images measure is blood flow. So you have to be convinced that increased blood flow to a part of the brain means that part of the brain is active. It might not be a hard argument to make, but it's also an inferential leap. We don't know, right? These measures blood flow. And so her argument is, how do scientists make us think that these are parts of the brain actively, like this is where thought lives for a lot of people, right? In these areas. That's where the thought's happening. But what's really being measured by the instrument is blood flow. It's sort of like when someone's speaking through a microphone, you think they're hearing their voice, but you're really hearing the microphone's interpretation of what's hitting it. And it's being projected, right? So it's this kind of a weird difference. It's kind of an uncanny difference.
One of the people that we're going to study is a guy named George Lakoff from University of California, Berkeley. And he'll talk a lot about rhetoric. He wrote a famous book called Metaphors We Live By. But he's really, if you ask him, what do you do? He's like, I'm a neurolinguistic expert. And he's like, he uses these diagrams that Steve just showed of the brain and blood flow to prove his point. He's like, look, it's lit up like a turkey. And Steve is absolutely right. They added coloring later.
Yeah,
it's not like your brain really lights up like that. But I think he kind of is misleading us by acting like it does.
Yeah, unless we believe it, and then it's science.
Yeah.
That's the fine line, right? It's like, oh, you're misleading us. This is just deceptive, weird information. Or, oh, that's scientific fact. That's the difference, right? History, rhetorics of history. How is history constructed? How do we determine what's historical fact or what's historical evidence? That's what rhetoricians look at. Over here we have rhetoric of science, a very big field down here too, with the an image. This is not a photo. It's made to look like a photo, but an image of something that does not exist, the DNA double helix. It's a theory. It's a construct that Watson and Crick made in order to explain how DNA works, but it's not something we can actually see. This is a mock-up of it. So that's an interesting rhetorical thing, is they made this design as a theory, as an explanation of how DNA must work. It must look like this, but it only must look like this for us as humans to apprehend it. There might be aliens who can see it in a different way, or at the microbial level, creatures can, at that subatomic level, can interpret and see DNA in different ways.
I always want someone to walk me
It's an
around
illusion.
Professor Yano was saying there might be aliens that can see this in a different way.
And then this is, of course, Copernicus with a very, very angry representative of the church. This is kind of like what happens in my office with the school administration all the time, explaining his thought and saying, look, it has to be this way. Rhetoric of science looks at historical scientific argument and how these scientists made their argument to very hostile audiences, how they were persuasive, how they made their proof, like Galileo, a big person people study, and how people responded to science and what the alternatives were. So I just read a great book on Kepler and how the planets orbit, because Copernicus said the planets were all taking perfect circular shapes, but the astrological data, when you look at the planets, they don't follow in the sky a perfect circular, they don't appear in the sky where they should if it was a perfect circle. And Kepler's the person who said, look, the orbits are elliptical. They have to be elliptical, and that's because of gravitation. Right? So he made this big argument based on something we can't see or access at all. It's all just math and persuasion. Right? Moving on, space and place. This is really incredibly popular. The study of memorials, monuments, museums, the 3 M's. How do these spaces construct knowledge? We think of something like the Vietnam Memorial as a marker or representation of historical fact, but this has rhetorical dimensions. It makes you think of the Vietnam War in a certain way, or identify, using the Burkean term, identify with the Vietnam War as being a certain kind of conflict, or a certain kind of event. So these memorials are as political and persuasive as they are representative or marking a particular historical, factual event. You know, you can think about the Korean memorial here, the Korean monument. And this is communicating a particular thing about what it was like to be in Korea, or a certain identification with those soldiers and troops. It's very interesting to think about these things as rhetorical elements, as not just being things that show us how it was, or things that commemorate a terrible national tragedy, but persuasive of that as well. There are many things that could be the Vietnam War Memorial. They had an open contest, and a young woman won, and this was her design, and that's what they did. Space and place. How does a museum, and the layout of a museum, which is carefully chosen by museum curators, how does that communicate what art should be and can be, and how your relationship to art should be? All of that is rhetorical. There's nothing factual about, there's nothing about it that's not up for persuasion. And that's what these scholars study. Visual rhetoric. This is the study of images and whether or not images can be arguments or be persuasive. And whether images are rhetorical. They constitute events. We think of photographs and images as being representation. And there's a lot of people saying, no, photographs are not representation of anything. They're not accurate factual depictions of anything. They're constructed entities. So we have several photos here. This is a photo called Ground Zero Spirit. It was taken September 12th, 2011, or it might have been taken September 11th. There's 3 firefighters raising the flag, and this image circulates as emblematic of what 9/11 was like or about. It was taken by an AP press photographer in New Jersey, and it's a super famous image. This is an image from during the Great Depression. FDR, as part of the New Deal, commissioned photographers to go around and capture what the Depression was like for people. This is a Dorothea Lange, I think.
Yeah, it's Dorothea.
Very famous photo of what it was like for people during the Great Depression.
And that's supposed to be the dust, when it...
Yeah, the Dust Bowl. Mm-hmm. And then this photo is from Vietnam, of American GIs. This one's like pulling out a cigarette, casually walking as a village has been napalmed, and these children have been burned by napalm. This one's, all her clothes have been burned off by the napalm, and she's screaming in pain, running towards the camera, and took a picture of it. So this photo is called Napalm Girl. It's not the most kind.
And that girl's alive.
Yeah, but this photo communicates something and persuades you about what Vietnam was like or about. Just like this is about 9/11, just like this about the Great Depression. These are all things that don't just show you They tell you, they persuade you, they rhetorically constitute that moment. And that's the way these scholars look at these things. Visual rhetoric is a really big field, really big deal, about how do I read this? Like, these images circulate, and people talk about what they mean. They look at this picture and they say, all you need to know about Vietnam comes from this. This is apparently communicative for people, right? All you need to know about 9/11 comes from this.
The question is that like picture of the napalm girl, is that making an argument? Is it? When you see that, are you like, wow, that's communicating more than just a girl running that's had her clothes burned off? Yeah, I think it is, right? Is that picture of that woman holding her baby with the other little kid behind, living in a tent, is that saying something more than, hey, look, they're camping? Yeah, it is, right? So there's an argument being made, even though they're just pictures. By the way, I think that's the second most famous Vietnam picture. Does anybody know the most famous one? Do you?
I know, never mind. I thought it was
There's a famous picture.
Yeah, the Bell Healy helicopter on top of the embassy.
No, that's pretty famous. That's not the one I'm thinking of. I'm thinking the one of the Vietnamese general shooting the guy in the head.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like just at the moment where his like brain is like going out the other side, and the guy just walks up.
Yeah, he's
the
just
guy
about
with
to
his hands,
pull the trigger.
Yeah, or he just has pulled the trigger, and he's kind of flinching because he's just pulled the trigger and the bullet just entered his brain, and he has his hands tied behind his back. Right. I think that's the most famous one. Execution.
Okay, so another thing people study is critical rhetoric, which is rhetorics of justice, fighting for different movements, fighting against oppression, identifying the rhetoric of oppression, identifying the rhetoric of eliminating oppression. This is studies of rhetoric and how it can be used in the service of justice, or how the study of rhetoric it might just be more than a scholarly pursuit, but it might be used to identify how certain systems of thought or ideologies keep other people in an oppressive or a subordinate state, and how they might be unaware of that, or maybe aware of it, but they're rendered powerless by the rhetorical structures that they live within. So one of the great things you could look at for critical rhetoric right now is the Black Lives Matter movement. And what is their response as a social movement to what they perceive as oppression, what they perceive as injustice, and how is society arguing back? What are the rhetorics that people are using to defend the police? What are the rhetorics that are being used to defend these communities? What are the rhetorical strategies of Black Lives Matter to get people who aren't involved on either side of this to see their complicity or to see their victimage? That would be a great thing to look at.
Does anybody know who Kathy Zoner is?
Yes.
She's the police chief for Cornell Police. When she heard about the Black Lives Matter thing, she's like, I got the perfect response. I will put this thing out that says all lives matter. What was the problem with that? There was already a group called All Lives Matter that was against Black Lives Matter. And they're like, how racist just to focus in on black lives. She wasn't trying to identify with that group, but immediately she was accidentally identified with like a white Aryan resistance group, which was a bad move.
Yeah, I mean, every word you've ever uttered and every word that you will utter has been said by someone already. So you have to think about the things that you say come with baggage. So you might say something and not mean it to be harmful, but it communicates a particular political position or particular hateful position that might...
She had to put out a press release that says, by the way, I'm not associated with the white Aryan resistance movement.
Yeah. It's probably a good press release. Sad that you have to do it. But a lot of critical rhetoricians look at social movements and study them historically and whether they were effective or not. But a lot of them look at ideology and how what we think is a normal, healthy life might be a way to sort of control us or a way to make us do things that are against our better, a better life for us. And they're invisible and they operate at very high levels. Okay, so speaking of that critical rhetoric, there have been challenges to rhetoric. 3 big challenges. This should look familiar to you. Yeah, the Foss.
We have a different version.
Yeah, this is a different book, but this is Dilip Gankar, who's a professor at Northwestern, and he said that the problem with rhetoric these days is after the Burkean and the postmodern theory split, everything can be considered rhetoric, which means nothing is special about rhetoric. There's nothing unique to it. If everything is rhetorical, then there's really no reason to study it. We can just go and study our own disciplines and be fine. Because rhetoric is something like the air that touches everything. And there's nothing particular to it. He also said that rhetoric is not a critical faculty. It's a productive one. So anybody who's doing theory or criticism is sort of off the mark. All the ancients who we draw from, Aristotle particularly, is much more practical than he was theoretical. This is argument. So if you're not teaching people how to speak and argue in front of more homogeneous audiences, if you're saying we can use Aristotle like Wilhelm's did, we can use Aristotle to critique oratory and speeches and say whether they're good or bad, you've missed the boat. That's not what it's about. We are misusing theory. We're misusing these texts. And people have written a lot about Gonkar's argument, a lot about what he's had to say. But he says, listen, the study of rhetoric needs to corral itself and be about particular things and particular stuff. It's fine for it to be about oratory, but rhetoric of buildings, rhetoric of food, really sort of dwindling the importance of rhetoric or its uniqueness.
How do you spell his name?
Oh gosh, I knew you would ask me that. Goankar,
Okay.
I think.
I don't know.
Even if you misspell it, Google will fix it. His first name is Dilip, D-I-L-I-P.
Okay.
Maybe 2 L's? I don't know.
Steve, we have 5 more minutes.
Okay, I can do it in 5 minutes. This is Sally Gearhart. Sally Gearhart wrote a very famous article in the 80s called The Womanization of Rhetoric, in which she said any attempt to persuade is an act of violence. It's an act of violence against others that comes from the patriarchy, an ideological system of thinking that puts women in a subordinate role and men at the top. And men don't have to be active sexists or against women to benefit from the patriarchy or even to participate in it. When you persuade someone, you say, hey, look, based on knowing nothing about you and my own experience of what I think, you should change your way of thinking and believing and doing without knowing anything about you. I don't know anything about you, and I'm going to change your mind. This is an act of violence akin to slapping or stabbing someone. All right? So to persuade is to be violent. And she says all these classic rhetoricians that I talked to you about are sort of patriarchal thinkers. And they advocate a particular kind of violence. And we need to come up with an alternative to rhetoric in order to get people to do things. Now, her alternative, you can read about it. I don't have time to get into it now. It's kind of complicated. But Sonia and Karen Foss and Griffin wrote an essay called Invitational Rhetoric. This is their public speaking book based on it, where they take Gearhart at face value and they say, let's create an alternative to traditional rhetoric called invitational rhetoric, where there's not a speaker persuading an audience, but an audience and speaker as equals influencing each other by sharing experiences. Let's have something more open, to where a speaker says, I'm just telling you about my experience and what I think, and I'd like to hear what you think, or I'd like to hear what you have to contribute as well. I'm not going to tell you how to think. Invitational rhetoric is considered to be sort of the foray of feminism into traditional rhetoric, or into rhetorical studies. But a lot of people say that it's too simple, and there are a lot better ways to introduce feminism into rhetoric. And a lot of other people have tried, but this one has a lot of staying power. This textbook, I've used it before. It's pretty good. But it's the idea that the rhetor doesn't take the floor saying, I know more than you. Your experience is null. Your life is null. I know what's best for you. Which Gearhart, Foss, and Griffin, and Gearhart all agree is a sign of sort of patriarchal thinking. Where there's some people whose thoughts are superior to others, or some people can tell other people how to be in the world. Which is a violent act, is what they say.
By the way, where have you heard this before? This invitational rhetoric. I, the teacher, don't know everything. You have to tell me your experiences, your perspectives. Have you ever had a professor like this?
You.
Thank you.
So yeah, I have written down here what invitational rhetoric does. According to them, they say it creates a safe, sharing space. It doesn't attempt to change minds directly, but appeals to influence. It's not a rejection of the Aristotelian tradition, but an alternative to Aristotelian rhetoric. And it's sharing, not address. Those are the things that they would say in the article. That's a real summation of what it is. But we've only got a couple minutes left. I want to give some time for questions or anything you want more coverage of or anything you want more depth on. If we only have a couple minutes left, it's really up to you. I didn't mean to talk the whole time, but I got excited.
I interrupted you quite a bit.
No, it was all right, Sam. It was good.
Are there any questions at all? Today's traveled many miles.
Yes?
So it's just very different than like, I guess the science that I'm used to that, like, it seems like a lot of the like thought is based on like, I don't know, philosophers so long ago. Are there new people come up with new ideas that are still like taken into consideration, or is this like kind of old?
Yeah, I mean, Burke's pretty new. It's like 1950s, 1960s. As far as 70s and 80s go, there are people doing so. There's a guy named Robert Scott who wrote an essay, Rhetoric is Epistemic. And then he was critiqued, and then he came back and wrote another essay. He was like, oh man, I really screwed that up. I was wrong. Kind of retracted what he said. Then there are people who did Rhetoric of Economics in the 80s. So there are new thinkers and thoughts about it. What rhetoricians have done recently is sort of adopted post-structuralist and postmodernist thinking as helpful to constitute or deconstruct the rhetorical. So people like Jacques Derrida, Foucault, Jean-Francis Lyotard, people like this, who they've adopted and said, these people are doing something similar to what we're doing. So if you go to a modern conference, you'll see people referencing a lot of this French theory in their rhetoric work. There are also lots of modern scholars writing today coming up with their own theories of things like witnessing, their own theories of memory, like public memory is a big one. Like, what does it mean to remember something together? Like, we just celebrated the anniversary of 9/11 as a serious, mournful, national, tragic day. What does it mean to constitute a national memory? A lot of people coming up with theories for that. Like, how do you do that? How do you do that and make sure it doesn't go off the rails? And then there's a lot of people like, you might in your hometown or maybe here in Ithaca or wherever you're from, there might be old war memorials or monuments that you walk by every day and you have no idea what they're about. And they're repurposed. There's like, people have fest parties there, bands play there. They might project images on them or something. You have no idea what it's originally for, but it's still used in a way. So memory shifts through time.
I just saw in my hometown in Merced, California, they took a hunk of one of the buildings of one of the World Trade Centers, and they put it in a glass case in Merced, California. And they're like, 9/11, remember.
Yeah.
And there was like someone taking a selfie.
Yeah. That's like identification, right?
Yeah.
Like people are like, I'm here at the site of national tragedy. They take a selfie and it's good. But then there was that young girl who was on tour at Auschwitz, the concentration camp. And she took a selfie there with her earbuds in and everything. Like, here I'm at Auschwitz, and people like flipped out. What's the difference, right? Here's the same text, same medium, same kind of thing. One is wrong, one's great. One's a great national pride moment. One is a horrifying, something a stupid teenage girl would do. And how insulting, and she must be an idiot, and da-da-da-da-da. Rhetoric, yeah?
Yeah. So